There's a moment in the season 7 premiere that most people remember for all the wrong reasons. We remember the bat. We remember the screaming. But there's something smaller, quieter, almost easy to miss. It's Daryl's fist, clenched tight at his side. In the seconds just before he moves, he's on his knees, same as everyone else, holding it all together. And then he isn't. One punch, that's all it takes. Glenn Rhee, the man who survived the prison, terminus, a quarry road and a dumpster, doesn't die because Negan planned it. He dies because Daryl Dixon threw one impulsive swing at the worst possible moment. Drop a stone into still water and watch what happens. The ripple doesn't ask for permission. It just moves. So who is really the dumbest character in The Walking Dead? Was it Daryl? Or is that entirely the wrong question? Let's find out together. Here's the thing about the word dumb. We throw it around when we watch The Walking Dead like it means something simple. Like a character just failed a logic test. Like they should have known better. Like the answer was obvious and they missed it. But pause for a second. Think about the world these people are actually living in. Every morning you wake up and the rules of everything you've ever known are gone. The people you love might be walker bait by nightfall. Every single choice, where to sleep, who to trust, whether to speak or stay silent, carries a weight that none of us have ever had to carry. So when we call someone dumb in the Walking Dead universe, what we're really saying most of the time is that this person's humanity got in the way of their survival. And that is a very different thing. It's Rick who puts this into words. Back in season 5, during Them, that brutal, grief-soaked episode where the group is walking through heat and dehydration after losing Beth. He says it quietly, like a man who has finally understood something terrible. We are the Walking Dead. He's not talking about the walkers. He means them. He means the cost of surviving this long in a world like that. What it takes hollows something out. The choices that look, from the outside, like stupidity, from inside all that grief and love and fear, often make complete sense. They're just human. What the show does at its best is use that humanity as both its engine and its tragedy. The writers, from Frank Darabont through Scott Gimple's long run into Angela Kang's era, understood something consistent. The apocalypse doesn't make people dumb. It reveals them. It takes whatever was already cracked and floods the crack with everything the world has to offer. Sam Anderson had anxiety long before the herd came through Alexandria. The sheltered life his mother Jessie built for him wasn't stupidity. It was love. The problem was that love built no real walls against what was coming. The apocalypse didn't give Sam his fears. It just took away every barrier between those fears and the world. So the pattern worth returning to as we move through this list isn't who failed the logic test. It's something more like whose specific fractures opened at the worst possible moment and who paid for it. Some of the decisions we're going to cover tonight will make you angry. Some will make you genuinely sad. A few might surprise you by making you feel something almost like understanding, even when you don't want to feel it. That's actually the point. The show was never interested in creating characters who were simply stupid. Even the characters fans historically dislike, like Laurie or Andrea, were given internal logic. The problem was usually that the external stakes outran their coping mechanisms faster than anyone could adjust. There's also a showrunner-level pattern worth noting, one that runs consistently across all 11 seasons and into every spin-off. Emotional impulse gets punished. Characters who lead with their hearts, who act before they calculate, who protect before they think, pay the highest visible prices. But the show never fully condemns them. Carol survives. Daryl survives. Glenn survived almost everything. The cold operators, Shane, the governor, Gregory, Spencer, don't win either. They just die differently. alone, unlamented, gutted in the street, or shot by someone who finally stopped following them. The show's quiet thesis is that survival without humanity isn't really survival. The cost of staying human is enormous, and the cost of abandoning it is just as high, just slower to arrive. Before we dive into the specific characters, I want to sit with that framework. The worst decisions on this show are almost never made by people who are stupid. They're made by people who are broken in very specific ways, under very specific pressures, at very specific moments. The show at its best knows the difference. So who crossed the line from understandable to something we genuinely couldn't forgive? That's where it starts to get interesting. To understand what happens to the Anderson family in season 6's No Way Out, you have to go back a few episodes. Back to season 5's Forget. Back to the moment when Carol Pelletier corners young Sam Anderson in the pantry and delivers what might be the cruelest thing she's ever said to a child, and she says it with total composure. She tells him that if he reveals what she's doing, stealing guns from the community's armory, she will tie him to a tree outside Alexandria's walls and let the monsters find him. She describes it in detail. He'll feel everything. And then she offers him cookies. That scene was always going to come back around. Carol planted something in Sam that night. Not malice on his part, but a specific, vivid terror. A blueprint for exactly how death would feel. And when Rick's group guts up their Walker ponchos and moves single file into the herd that has flooded Alexandria's streets in No Way Out, Sam carries that blueprint with him in the dark. It starts with something small and unavoidable. Sam sees a Walker child among the dead, small, shuffling, ragged. And something in his mind locks onto Carol's description. The cookies, the tree, the feeling. He says, "Mom," almost a whisper, almost involuntarily, and that small sound is the stone hitting the water. Jessie turns. The Walkers find her, and they pull her down, and she won't let go of Carl's hand. Rick raises his hatchet and does what he has to. And Ron, watching his mother die, his father already gone, Michonne's blade already through him from behind. Ron's reflex pulls the trigger. The bullet takes Carl's eye, an entire family, gone in under 2 minutes. And the chain that started it was a threat whispered over cookies by a woman who was only trying to protect her people. What makes the Anderson sequence so devastating, and why it belongs near the top of any conversation about catastrophic decision-making in this show, is that almost none of it was stupidity in any traditional sense. Sam was, as the show carefully establishes in the first half of season 6, genuinely traumatised. He stopped leaving his room after his father Pete's execution. He drew pictures and wouldn't come downstairs. He was 9 years old and had watched his abusive father die in the street and had lived most of his short life inside Alexandria's walls, which had never prepared him for anything real. What happens to Sam in No Way Out isn't a failure of intelligence. It's the failure of every protection his community never actually gave him. It's worth pausing on something uncomfortable here because Ron's situation is different. Ron, who is older, who had already attempted to kill Carl in season 6's Heads Up using a locked garage and the darkness, carries more agency than his younger brother. His jealousy over Enid, his rage at Rick for his father's death, his careful manoeuvring toward revenge. These are calculated in the way that a furious and grieving teenager calculates. And yet, in the moment Michonne's blade goes through him, he isn't calculating anymore. He's just destroyed, watching the last of his family get eaten alive. The gun going off isn't a plan. It's the last thing a person does when there is nothing left. Here's what I keep returning to when I sit with this sequence. The show places its moral weight carefully. It's not really Sam who carries the weight of this, or even fully Ron. It's the community that built walls without building the people inside them. Carol's threat is brutal, but it came from desperate necessity. Alexandria's peace was always borrowed. The Andersons were its truest product, beautiful and completely unprepared for the actual world. Was Sam dumb? I don't think that's the word. I think he was a child that no one got to in time, and that's a sadder thing in the end than stupidity ever is. But Sam isn't even close to the top of this list. Laurie Grimes is, by most fan consensus, one of the most controversial characters the franchise ever produced. The car crash in Season 2's Nebraska has become almost shorthand in the fandom. An immediate example when anyone asks, "What's the dumbest thing that ever happened on this show?" The image of a pregnant woman reading a road map while driving alone through the apocalypse, flipping her car into a ditch over a walker, lands with a particular kind of frustration. And it is, objectively, a bad decision, a genuinely, frustratingly bad one. But here's where the conversation needs to go a little deeper. Laurie doesn't crash the car because she's careless. She crashes it because she's operating on pure emotional urgency, the way she operates consistently all season. Herschel has disappeared to a bar after the barn massacre, the moment when the group finally opened Herschel's barn and found Sophia among the dead. Rick is already out there looking. The group is in shock. Nobody else is moving. Daryl refuses to go. So Laurie takes a car, alone at night, and tries to do what she always does, fix it, move toward the crisis. She just does it in the most reckless possible way, which is also, honestly, completely consistent with who she is. Robert Kirkman acknowledged in The Walking Dead Deluxe issue 8 that he mishandled Laurie's character, and that's a striking admission from a creator. What he means, I think, is not that Laurie was wrong to make emotional decisions, but that the show never gave her emotional decisions that felt earned or legible to the audience. She pushed Rick to deal with Shane, then was horrified when he did. She'd been with Shane believing Rick was dead, and struggled with the aftermath in ways that came across as contradictory rather than genuinely complex. She was carrying a pregnancy of uncertain paternity through an apocalypse, and never quite got the space to feel that weight fully on screen before her death in Season 3. The car crash in Nebraska is the crystallized version of the Laurie problem. The choice itself, driving alone, reading a map while pregnant, lands as absurd because the show had given us no internal scaffolding to make it feel desperate rather than reckless. But drop a stone into this particular water and trace where the ripples go, and they travel far. Laurie's crash brings Shane to her, which gives Shane leverage, which fuels his unravelling in ways that define the rest of Season 2. Her pregnancy drives the entire emotional engine of the prison arc. Her death in childbirth is the wound in Rick that never fully heals. The hallucinations, the phone calls to a dead woman, the years of hollow leadership that follow. Carl carries the cost of all of it, all the way to his own death in Season 8. One flipped car. The ripple moves through the entire story. What complicates this, and I don't want to gloss over it, is the production level reality. The show never quite figured out what to do with Laurie. The comics version is complicated but sympathetic, in ways the television version rarely achieved. The writing kept her reactive rather than active, emotional rather than emotional, with purpose. And when a character only ever responds to crises rather than shapes them, every response looks desperate, looks dumb. Here's the reflection I keep coming back to with Laurie. Almost every decision she makes on this show, the crash, the affair, the push toward violence, makes internal sense if you read it as the behaviour of someone who is fundamentally terrified of stillness, terrified of the moment when she can't act or fix or push anymore. The apocalypse didn't create Laurie Grimes's anxiety. It took away every socially acceptable outlet for it and replaced them with cars and walkers and a husband who was becoming someone she didn't recognise. That's not stupidity. That's a woman drowning with her hands full, reaching for the nearest rope. The show deserved to treat her more carefully than it did. At least Laurie's mistakes came from love. Our next one. Pure cowardice. If the Andersons represent fractured innocence, and Laurie represents misread desperation, Nicholas represents something the show returns to periodically and almost never resolves comfortably. Cowardice that wears survival as its face. By the time we reach season 6's Thank You, the episode that sent the entire fandom into a month-long spiral of grief and argument, Nicholas had already built a genuine file of culpability. He'd gotten Noah killed in season 5's Spend, a moment so brutal and preventable that it still aches to revisit. The revolving door, the hands through the glass. Nicholas had saved himself and let the door swing, and Glenn had watched it happen, and had chosen, in a decision that defines Glenn's entire arc, to let Nicholas live anyway. Glenn extending mercy to Nicholas was not a small thing. It was the thesis of Glenn's character, walking forward on two legs. He believed, genuinely and stubbornly, that you could choose to be the kind of person who doesn't abandon people, even people who have abandoned you. And for a while across season 6's early episodes, it almost looked like it might work. Nicholas seemed to be finding something. In Thank You, he's with Glenn's group, helping manage the panicked Alexandrians, following instructions. There are moments where you almost believe the show will let him earn it. And then they're on top of the dumpster, surrounded, and something in Nicholas's face changes. It's not panic exactly, it's something quieter and more final than panic. He turns to Glenn, says thank you, and puts the gun to his own temple. The shot comes. His body falls into Glenn, knocking them both off the dumpster and into the herd below. What follows is one of the most controversial creative choices in the show's history. For nearly 3 weeks and across 3 episodes, the show implied Glenn was dead, removing Stephen Yeun from the opening credits, refusing to confirm survival. When Heads Up aired and Glenn crawled out from beneath the dumpster, Nicholas's body having partially shielded him, the response was somewhere between relief and genuine anger. Critics and fans felt manipulated, and they weren't entirely wrong. But setting aside the narrative trick for a moment, this is worth sitting with. The dumpster sequence does something emotionally true. Nicholas's thank you is the only honest thing he says in the episode. He knows he's failing again. He knows he's about to do what he always does. And maybe, in some small corner of himself, he knows that Glenn, who has been carrying the weight of his mercy for months, doesn't deserve to watch it happen without some kind of acknowledgement. The gratitude is real. The cowardice is real. The tragedy is that they arrive at the same moment, in the same breath. The pattern the show draws around characters like Nicholas is worth noting. Second chances are never free in this universe. Glenn gave Nicholas his because Glenn believed in people fundamentally. Carol gave Morgan something like a second chance, and it cost her Connie in season 10. Rick gave the Alexandrians second chances, and it cost him Alexandria itself. The mercy is not the mistake. The mistake, according to the show's internal logic, is trusting that mercy can transform someone whose fractures run deeper than mercy can reach. Nicholas's fractures ran all the way down. What sticks with me most, though, the thing I can't shake, is that the show never lets you hate Nicholas cleanly. We're supposed to, a little. He gets Noah killed. He nearly gets Glenn killed twice. And yet the final image of him, the thank you, the gun, the terrible quiet of it before the shot, it makes him human in the worst possible way. A man who couldn't become what the world needed him to be, and who knew it. Nicholas was selfish in a specific, broken, ultimately tragic way. Spencer Monroe was something worse. Spencer was calculating. The thing about Spencer Monroe that makes him such a compelling case study in catastrophic judgment is that he genuinely believed he was smart. Not just brave, smart. He watched his mother Deanna build Alexandria from nothing, watched her navigate relationships with the patience of a diplomat, and he seems to have absorbed the lesson that if you play the political game correctly, you can come out on top of anything. What he missed, what he somehow never absorbed from watching Deanna, was that his mother's politics were built on genuine care for her community. Spencer played a version of it that was purely transactional. And in season 7, that version met Negan. The events of Heart Still Beating are almost Shakespearean in their structure. Rick's group is under saviour occupation. Alexandria is hollowed out, demoralised, stripped of weapons and dignity in the aftermath of the premiere. Spencer, who has been nursing his resentment since season 6, stealing supplies back from Negan's pickup crew in season 7's Service, blaming Rick for Glenn and Abraham's deaths to anyone who will listen, finally sees what he thinks is his opening. Rick is away on a supply run. Negan is in Alexandria, making himself comfortable in the most unsettling way possible. So Spencer puts on dress pants, pours something drinkable, and walks up to Negan across a billiard table with an offer he believes is irresistible. He tells Negan that Rick is dangerous, that Rick will never truly cooperate, that everyone in Alexandria would be better served with Spencer in charge. He frames it as a practical suggestion between reasonable men. Negan's response is the kind that gets remembered. He observes that Rick, despite hating everything about the situation, is out there right now, gathering shit for me. Swallowing his hate and getting the work done. That takes something real. Spencer, by contrast, waited until Rick was gone. And that, Negan says, means Spencer has no guts at all. Then he makes the metaphor literal, drawing a knife, and Spencer Monroe dies on an Alexandria street with the consequences of his miscalculation on public display. The ripple from Spencer's death extends far beyond Spencer himself. Rosita, furious and grief-struck, fires the bullet she'd been saving, Eugene's single handcrafted round, at Negan. She misses. Negan, enraged, orders Olivia executed and then takes Eugene back to the sanctuary as a prisoner. In one afternoon, Spencer's scheme costs Alexandria 2 lives, its only bullet, and its most creative technical mind. The Monroe family, Deanna, Aiden, and now Spencer, is entirely gone from the story. What's so interesting about Spencer, in the context of this list, is that his decision-making has a logic that's almost admirable in its wrongness. He watched Rick alienate allies, take risks and lose people. He genuinely believed a more diplomatic approach might serve the community better. He wasn't entirely without a point. What he catastrophically misjudged was his specific audience. The calculus that might have worked on a thoughtful power broker, on someone like his mother, was exactly backwards with Negan, who valued direct strength above all else, and who would sooner respect a man who punched him in the face than one who waited for his back to turn. Spencer's mistake wasn't that he tried to play politics, it was that he played the wrong politics with someone for whom the rules were entirely different, and he'd never bothered to learn what those rules actually were. He'd watched Negan for months, he still didn't see him clearly. The emotional weight here isn't just Spencer's death, it's what it reveals about Alexandria in that moment. The community was so fractured, so defeated under occupation, that one of its own was willing to turn on its leader in exchange for personal advancement. Deanna Monroe's vision of Alexandria, the civilization her son inherited and ultimately corrupted into something transactional, died in a quiet street in the middle of the afternoon. There's something genuinely sad about that, even through the frustration of watching Spencer walk into it. He mistook cruelty for strategy and paid with everything. But what about someone whose single mistake lasted an entire season? and cost the lives of people who trusted him completely. Eugene Porter arrives in the story in season 4 with a mullet, a shotgun he can barely hold steady, and what turns out to be the most consequential lie the franchise ever produced. He tells Abraham Ford, and through Abraham, anyone willing to listen, that he is a scientist with the Human Genome Project, that he knows what caused the Walker outbreak, and that there is a functioning terminal in Washington, D.C., where his knowledge can begin reversing it. He says it with just enough technical vocabulary and just enough calm to be credible. And Abraham, who had lost his family and was seconds from suicide when Eugene first called out for help, grabs onto the mission like a lifeline. Because it is one. The lie runs through season 4 and deep into season 5. 17 episodes in total, spanning the fall of the prison, the road to Terminus, the brutality of Terminus itself, and a long grinding march through Georgia heat. People die protecting Eugene on this mission. Abraham names them when everything finally comes apart. Quietly, like a man itemizing a debt. Stephanie, Warren, Pam, Rex, Roger, Josiah, Dirk, Josephine. 8 people who gave their lives for a destination that never existed. The confession happens in season 5's Self-Help, a focused, contained episode that keeps the Eugene and Abraham story tight and doesn't let either of them escape cleanly. The group is on a highway, blocked by a massive Walker herd that should have been the signal to turn back. Eugene finally says it simply, in a voice that has stopped performing. I'm not a scientist. He tells them he's smarter than most people, that he knew he couldn't survive alone, that the lie was the only protection he had. Abraham's response is to beat him unconscious. Rosita draws her gun to stop it. Eugene doesn't fight back. What makes the Eugene reveal so emotionally rich is the dual devastation. Yes, 8 people are dead for a fiction. Yes, months of dangerous travel were spent chasing a destination that never existed. But the other dimension, the one the episode weights most heavily through Abraham's flashbacks, is the damage done to the man who needed the lie most. Abraham's family had fled from him in terror after watching what he was capable of in protection. They'd run, and they died while running, and Abraham had been sitting in a road with a gun to his head when Eugene's cries reached him. The mission gave him a reason to still be alive. Eugene knew this, and he used it. This is where dumb genuinely collapses as a useful frame. Was Eugene dumb? His lie created enormous downstream damage and cost lives. But it also kept Abraham alive long enough to find Rosita, to become part of Rick's community, to have years of meaningful connection and purpose. It's possible that without the lie, everyone in that group dies differently and sooner. Eugene is the most self-aware character on this list by some distance. He knows exactly what he is and what he cannot do, and he engineered a survival strategy accordingly. That strategy happened to cost other people enormously. The pattern the show draws around Eugene is consistent across the franchise's full run. His deception is simultaneously his greatest flaw and his only reliable survival mechanism. In season 7, he weaponizes the same impulse with Negan, convincing the saviors of his genuine loyalty while quietly, carefully undermining them from within. In season 8, he manufactures bullets for the wrong side while building something else. Eugene is almost never what he appears to be in any given moment, and the show rewards him with one of the franchise's longer survivor arcs. There's a quiet discomfort in that reward, though. 8 names: Stephanie, Warren, Pam, Rex, Roger, Josiah, Dirk, Josephine. Eugene says them all in that highway confrontation, and the episode doesn't let you forget them. The question of whether Eugene was dumb is genuinely hard. The question of whether he made choices that cost real people their real lives is not. He carries that weight forward, which might be its own kind of sentence. Eugene lied to survive, Andrea had every chance to survive. She just didn't take it. Andrea's death in the season 3 finale. Welcome to the Tombs is the one that still sits wrong with people, years later. Not because it's the most graphic or the most surprising. By the end of season 3, the show had taken a lot from us. But Andrea's death has this particular quality of feeling, almost engineered for maximum frustration, because at every step of the process, exits were available. She just didn't take any of them. The most famous of these is the pliers scene. The governor has stabbed Milton and locked him in a room with Andrea, her wrists secured to a dental chair. Milton, bleeding out on the floor, tells her before consciousness leaves him that he hid pliers behind the chair for exactly this scenario. He's giving her a way out, even as he's dying. Andrea works to reach them with her feet. She gets them. She fumbles with the cuff mechanism, and then she pauses to talk to Milton. She asks him why he didn't tell her sooner. She says things that matter to her. She loses time. Milton turns and bites her neck, in the instant before she gets the cuff free. Her dying words to Rick, with Michonne holding her hand in the room's dim light, include the line that the episode frames as the truth of her entire arc. I had a chance to kill him. He was asleep. I had a knife. She knew. She'd had the governor's sleeping face and a blade, and she'd chosen diplomacy. Chosen the belief that Woodbury could be steered towards something better rather than needing to be ended. That choice came from Andrea's essential character. She was always oriented toward preservation, toward finding a path through rather than around. And the show punishes her for it, with a death that felt, to many viewers, deeply unfair. Here's the part of the story that matters for how we actually understand Andrea's arc. Actress Laurie Holden has spoken publicly about the fact that her character was not originally intended to die. She had a contract for an extended run. The death was a late-season creative decision by showrunner Glenn Mazzara, made close to filming the finale. In the comics, Robert Kirkman's source material, Andrea is one of the most essential long-term characters, Rick's partner through the Commonwealth arc and beyond, a genuine leader and survivor. The television version never got to be that character. She was written into progressively narrower spaces by choices that isolated her from the group and placed her in reactive positions. And when she finally had real agency, when she had the knife and the governor and the choice, the show had her choose wrong. Was Andrea dumb? I keep circling that question honestly, from inside her worldview, from inside her belief that the governor could be reached, that Woodbury's people deserved a mediator rather than an executioner, that violence cycles. Her choices have a coherent logic. Carol had told her directly during the prison visit, seduce him, kill him while he sleeps. Andrea went back to Woodbury and didn't. Part of that was fear, and part of it was a genuine ethical resistance to the idea that assassination was the only answer left. She wasn't simply failing to think clearly. What she failed to fully account for was who she was dealing with. The governor was not a man whose violence could be contained through negotiation. He had demonstrated this clearly at the National Guard station, in the fight pits, in everything that had already happened. Andrea had access to all of this information, and she still found a way to believe there was a version where talking worked. That faith and that humanising, stubborn conviction that there's always a path where things can be made right is one of the things that made Andrea genuinely interesting as a character. It's also the exact thing the show chose to kill her for. Her death says as much about the writing room as it does about her judgment. And holding both of those things at once feels like the most honest way to sit with her story. At least Andrea's failures were slow burn, accumulated across a season of wrong turnings. Daryl's took about 2 seconds. There's a moment right before it happens that I always want to rewind and stay inside. Season 7, Episode 1. Abraham has just been killed, and the group is on its knees in the dark, and Negan is moving through them. with the performance of control he always puts on. He's talking. He's almost enjoying himself. Somewhere in that darkness, Daryl Dixon is absorbing something that has no safe place to go. Abraham was Daryl's kind of person. Big, direct, profane, loyal in that way that doesn't need to be stated out loud. They weren't close in the soft, expressive sense, but they understood each other in the way that people who've survived the same things understand each other without needing to articulate it. Watching Negan kill Abraham with a kind of deliberate showmanship designed to humiliate as much as destroy. Daryl processes it. He holds it. And then Negan leans toward Rosita with the blood still on his weapon, taunting her. And Daryl is moving before he can stop himself. One punch. And Negan turns to the group and says that someone has to pay for that. And Glenn Rhee, who just survived a dumpster, who ran the quarry, who found Maggie and was going to be a father, Glenn is the one who pays. The moment is almost unbearable to return to even now. And I think the reason it keeps its power is because Daryl's punch doesn't feel like a mistake. In the moment, it feels like the most human thing anyone could possibly do. The group has been on their knees for hours. They've watched a man they loved get beaten to death in front of them. Negan is right there within reach, and Daryl has spent years of his life not submitting, not kneeling, not letting the world take things from him without fighting back. The punch comes from the deepest part of who he is, and it kills Glenn. Here's the case for Daryl's punch being the single most consequential, impulsive act in the entire franchise, not the most dramatically staged. The show has bigger set pieces. But in terms of pure cause and effect, nothing else on this list comes close. Glenn's death reshapes everything downstream. Maggie's entire grief arc across seasons 7 and 8. The Hilltop's trajectory under her leadership. The specific texture of Daryl's quiet guilt that threads through everything that follows in the main show. Glenn's death reshapes Negan too. Eventually. The thing he most has to answer for, the name he can't put down. In Dead City, Maggie and Negan are operating in a world that Glenn's death built, shaped by the specific way it happened, by who threw the punch and why. The show is careful, though, never to fully frame this as stupidity. Daryl is never presented as someone who made the wrong call because he lacked intelligence, he made the human call. And the franchise, across every spin-off and season, keeps returning to the quiet argument that there is no truly right call when the price of making it is becoming someone who doesn't feel anymore. Rick makes tactical decisions that cost him pieces of himself with everyone. Carol makes cold calculations that she comes back to in private and cries over. The survivors who stay alive the longest are the ones who manage to remain human while trying to be strategic. It's an impossible balance. Daryl tips it for 1 second in a field in the dark and Glenn dies. What the punch also does, what I think is worth sitting with for a moment, is reframe the whole question at the centre of tonight's conversation. Because Daryl isn't someone you can look at and say, this person consistently made poor decisions. His arc across the full run of the show is one of the most carefully developed in the franchise. The punch isn't evidence of stupidity. It's evidence of love pushed past the place where love can be held quietly anymore. And in a show that keeps asking whether love is worth the cost of survival, whether the human part of us is a feature or a fatal flaw. Daryl's punch might be the thesis statement. The dumbest act may be the one born of the most love. So if love makes us dumb, what does that say about Beth? Beth Green's death in Season 5's Coda is the one that still divides the fandom in a particular way, even years out. Not over whether it was sad. Everyone agrees it was devastating, but over what it actually meant. Was it a senseless death at the hands of writing that needed to service Daryl's emotional arc? Was it a meaningful act of resistance? Was it the most avoidable death in the franchise's history? Or was it the one moment in Beth's entire journey where she finally got to act on her own terms? I've been sitting with all of those interpretations for a long time. The most honest answer, I think, is that they're all partly true, which makes it harder, not easier. Here's what actually happened. Season 5's coda ends with a hostage exchange between Rick's group and the Grady Memorial officers. Beth is released in exchange for 2 captured officers. The exchange is complete. Beth is standing in the middle of the lobby, free, her people right there across the room. And then she turns to Officer Dawn, the woman who has been running Grady with a mixture of institutional ideology and genuine cruelty. And she pulls out the small scissors she'd kept hidden through all of it. She stabs Dawn in the shoulder. Dawn reflexively draws her weapon and shoots Beth in the head. The group watches. Daryl watches. And then Dawn is dead too. Rick shoots her, and the exchange becomes a bloodbath over a decision that technically didn't need to be made. Beth was free. She was going home. Whether this constitutes dumb is genuinely uncomfortable to assess, and I want to take it seriously rather than land easily on either side. From a pure survival calculation, yes, it was the wrong choice. The hostage situation was resolved. Beth had survived Grady, had found a way to maintain herself under enormous psychological pressure, and had a clear exit. She chose to use it for something other than escape. But look at why. Beth had spent the entire Grady arc watching Dawn enforce a system that extracted labour from vulnerable people under the guise of protection, using debt and dependency to keep people compliant, keeping an economy of exploitation running behind the language of safety. She'd pushed against it in small, quiet ways all season. The scissors were the culmination of a sustained conviction. Stabbing Dawn wasn't impulsive in the way Daryl's punch was impulsive. It came from a slow-built certainty that what was happening at Grady was wrong, and that she wasn't going to leave without naming that wrongness out loud. Was she wrong to make that statement at that exact moment, with freedom 30 feet away? Probably. Did the show build toward it as the logical endpoint of her arc? Yes. 2 seasons of Beth Green developing from near hopelessness, from the character who couldn't see a reason to go on in season 2, into someone who would rather make a final statement than simply be rescued. The scissors are the inverse of the bathtub. Whether the show earned that inversion or needed Beth to die to fuel Daryl's season 7 grief is a question worth asking, and one without a clean answer. The motif matters here in a particular way. Daryl carries Beth out of Grady Memorial in his arms, a mirror of earlier moments when he'd carried her as she healed, as she relearned to walk after her leg mended. His grief from that corridor runs directly into the man on his knees in season 7's field. The stone that hit the water in the Grady lobby made a ripple that reached all the way to Glenn's death. In the specific shape of Daryl's accumulated, unprocessed, unbearable sadness, and his inability to hold still one more time in one more dark field. Was Beth dumb? I keep returning to the question, and keep not being able to say yes cleanly. I think she made a choice that cost her everything, and that the choice came from who she had become rather than from a failure to think. Whether the writers made the right decision, that's a different question, and one that doesn't resolve comfortably. Every choice on this list had a ripple, but one mistake created more ripples than any other. We've been circling it all night, so let's actually make the case. If we're being strictly technical about cause and effect, if we're measuring dumbest purely by consequence, by the downstream damage a single decision created and how far those ripples actually travelled, then Daryl Dixon's punch in season 7's premiere is the answer. Not because Daryl is a character who lacks intelligence, not because he consistently makes poor decisions across the full arc of his story, but because that one specific choice, in that one specific moment, triggered a chain of events that reshaped the entire franchise, in ways still being felt. The evidence chain is hard to argue with. Glenn dies immediately. Maggie Rhee, pregnant, who had just spent months not knowing if her husband was alive, has to watch her child's father get beaten to death in front of her. The grief that follows is so complete, so foundational to everything Maggie does in seasons 7 and 8, and beyond, that it becomes the engine of the Hilltops War, the texture of Maggie's leadership, and the specific emotional architecture of Dead City, where she and Negan are still years later, operating in the world Glenn's death constructed. Daryl's guilt is quieter, but just as persistent. It threads through his interactions with Maggie, through his unwillingness to talk about it, through the weight he carries in every season that follows. And Negan's eventual reckoning with Glenn's death, the thing he can't put down even in his own moral accounting, is what makes their dynamic in Dead City function at all. One punch. All of that. But here's where the theory has to be honest about its own complexity. The show itself never frames Daryl's punch as stupidity. It frames it as the cost of being human. And there's a pattern running consistently across the franchise that complicates any reading of Daryl's choice as simply the series' most foolish moment. The characters who act from emotional impulse are not the ones the franchise condemns in the end. They're the ones it tends to keep alive. Consider who survives across the entire run of the main show and into the spin-offs. Carol, who operates on love and grief and tactical fury, but always starts from the emotional rather than the calculated. Daryl himself, who has never easily articulated what he feels but has always acted on it. Even Negan, and this is worth sitting with, who is brutal and calculating on the surface, and yet survives partly because his emotional instincts, when they finally engage genuinely, are more reliable than his ideology. The cold operators, Shane, the governor, Gregory, Spencer, the CRM's clinical hierarchy, don't win in any lasting way. They win some rounds. Then they're alone. The show's counter pattern seems to be this. Emotional people make bigger single mistakes, but they're also capable of genuine connection, and connection is what actually keeps communities alive across the long term. You can't separate Daryl's punch from Daryl's capacity for loyalty. You can't take one without the other. The same thing that made him throw the punch is the same thing that kept Alexandria, the hilltop, and eventually the Commonwealth from collapsing into pure self-interest. There's an alternative theory worth mentioning here, one that circulates in the fandom and that I find genuinely interesting. Maybe the dumbest character isn't a fixed answer at all. Maybe it shifts by season, depending on who the story needs to sacrifice next. Every season creates a character whose specific mistakes are the engine of that season's tragedy. Shane's jealousy drives season 2. The governor's obsession drives season 3. Spencer's ambition drives early season 7. According to this reading, dumbness in The Walking Dead is as much a narrative function as a character trait. The story always needs someone to drop the stone. The question is just whose hand it's in this time around. Both readings can be true at once. Daryl's punch is the most consequential single act of impulsive bad judgment in the franchise's canon, and it is the most human act in the franchise's canon. The show makes those two things intentionally the same, because its real argument has always been that survival without humanity isn't worth having, even if humanity is, occasionally, the thing that gets Glenn killed. Every mistake on this list, every stone, every ripple, this is where it starts to click, or at least it might. If you step back from the individual cases and look at the franchise as a whole, all 11 seasons of the main show, Fear the Walking Dead's full run, World Beyond, Daryl Dixon, Dead City, a consistent pattern emerges. It's not random which characters end up discussed on lists like this one. It follows a shape. The Scott Gimple era of the main show roughly seasons 4 through 8, the longest continuous run under one showrunner, is where the highest consequence impulsive decisions are most densely concentrated. Glenn's dumpster fake-out, Carl's solo outings, season 4's After, where he nearly gets cornered by walkers while trying to prove his independence from a bedridden Rick, Beth's scissors, Daryl's punch. These are all products of the Gimple era. Gimple himself spoke in a Looper exclusive about having regrets, acknowledging that 80 episodes of showrunning will inevitably produce mistakes. He was moved to Chief Content Officer after Season 8, partly in response to fan exhaustion with what felt like gratuitous emotional manipulation. The dumpster fake-out, 3 weeks of implied Glenn death, resolved in a heads-up episode that landed around 52% on Rotten Tomatoes, became a kind of symbol of the era's approach to viewer trust. Angela Kang's run from Season 9 onward has its own entries. Henry following the Whisperers alone in Season 9's Guardians, a teenager trailing an army of people wearing zombie skin, unarmed, draws genuine frustration, eventually paid for with his placement on Alpha's pike. But the overall pattern of catastrophic individual choices creating franchise-wide ripples is less concentrated in Kang's run. Her characters tend to fail in more collective, systemic ways. The fall of the fair, the cave disaster in Season 10, the Commonwealth's structural unravelling across Season 11. The mistakes are still present, but they're distributed, owned by institutions and communities rather than individual moments of impulse. The spin-offs tell a related story. Fear the Walking Dead's most discussed character mistake belongs to Chris Manawa in Season 2, Travis's son, who descends through a series of choices that each feel slightly more unhinged than the last, until he has murdered a sleeping man, abandoned his father, and joined a group of travelling killers who eventually turn on him. Reddit fandom has informally designated Chris the franchise's most frustrating character, partly because his trajectory felt constructed for shock rather than earned through psychology. Travis's own sustained refusal to engage with firearms throughout Season 1, while his family is clearly in danger, draws its own category of frustration, though it comes from a consistent characterization. Travis as a genuine pacifist in deep conflict with his world, rather than from narrative convenience. World Beyond, Daryl Dixon and Dead City all operate with shorter run times and tighter production scopes, which naturally produces fewer opportunities for the kind of extended, slow burn, catastrophic decision-making that characterise the main show's longer middle seasons. The world building in these productions also tends to foreground institutional failures rather than individual ones. The CRM's clinical brutality, the Commonwealth's class mechanics, Negan's attempt to build something worth inheriting. These shift the conversation from who was dumb toward what systems produce this outcome, which is a different and arguably more interesting question. The franchise thesis, running across all of these productions, is the same one we've been circling throughout. The dead are set dressing. They're dangerous in clusters, capable of cornering you if you're careless or unlucky. But the real engine of tragedy in the Walking Dead universe is always human. The living destroy themselves. The most dangerous thing in any of these communities isn't the herd pressing against the walls. It's the person inside who couldn't cope with what they'd seen, or couldn't be honest about what they needed, or couldn't hold their impulse for 30 more seconds. What might be the franchise's most honest, long-term confession? The thing you can see running quietly beneath every showrunner transition is this: everyone who took over the story tried to fix the dumb decisions problem and ended up replicating some version of it. Because the story needs its mistakes. Tension requires misjudgment. Characters can only reveal who they are through choices, and choices under genuine pressure will sometimes be catastrophically wrong. The question was never how to make a show where no one makes bad decisions. It was always how to make a show where the bad decisions feel inevitable and human and earned. There's something worth sitting with before we close, and it might be the most honest thing in this entire conversation. Almost every decision on this list makes complete sense from inside the character's emotional state at the time. I mean that literally. Not makes sense in a forgiving, charitable way. Makes sense as the logical output of who that person was under those specific conditions at that specific moment. Sam Anderson was terrified of walkers in a visceral, specific way that a child with unaddressed anxiety, raised inside perfect walls, watching his abusive father executed in the street, would be terrified. Laurie Grimes was operating on emotional urgency in that car because stillness felt unbearable and her marriage had crumbled and she was pregnant and running on fear and love simultaneously. Nicholas had spent months watching his own cowardice cost people their lives and had no internal mechanism that could correct it. No rope long enough to climb. Spencer had watched everyone he loved die and had inherited a political instinct from his mother that never translated properly to the world that replaced hers. Eugene had exactly one tool, his intelligence and his ability to construct fictions. And he used it the way desperate people use their only available thing. Andrea believed in negotiation because she'd witnessed enough violence to understand what it cost, and she chose wrong about who was reachable. These are not stupid people. They are people whose psychological profiles encountered situations specifically engineered by the apocalypse and by the show's writers to break those profiles along their existing fault lines. Every crack in every character was found and pressured. Every single person on this list had an internal logic. Every single one. Which raises the second counterpoint, one the show itself seems to be making in retrospect. It needs these mistakes. Without them, there's no story. Tension in long-form survival drama requires that characters make choices that feel wrong in retrospect. Without Daryl's punch, Glenn lives. And the franchise loses one of the most devastating emotional anchors in its history. Without Andrea's failed escape, Season 3 ends without consequence for the governor. Without Sam's whisper in the dark, the Alexandria arc doesn't have its most human moment. The mistakes aren't failures of craft, they're part of it. The question is whether they feel earned or engineered. And that's a different standard, and a harder one to apply. Robert Kirkman admitting he mishandled Laurie's character points toward a third consideration. Writer failure and character failure are not the same thing. When a character makes choices that feel disconnected from their established psychology, when decisions seem to serve the plot rather than grow from who the person is, the audience correctly identifies this as a problem with the writing rather than evidence of the character's stupidity. Laurie's car crash has the shape of character failure, but may actually be writer convenience. Andrea's death was a last-minute decision that overrode an 8-season contract. These production realities shape how we read the characters, sometimes unfairly. This leads to the alternative reading I find most uncomfortable and most honest. The dumbest character is whoever the audience had the least empathy for. And that's not a fixed property of the character. It's a reflection of the relationship between the character, the writing, and the specific viewer in the specific moment. Laurie is widely cited as dumb, Carl in early seasons, Andrea. But all three were operating with genuine internal logic. What they lacked, what made audiences' patience thin, was legibility. The show failed to make their internal experience visible enough for the emotional reasoning to track in real time. Ron was a traumatized teenager. Sam was a child. Andrea was failed by her own show. Spencer was a person who had watched his entire family die and received no real support from anyone and made a terrible bet on the wrong man. None of these are villains. They're people who ran out of runway at different speeds, in different ways, for reasons that mostly make heartbreaking sense when you look at them long enough. The question worth sitting with isn't which one was the dumbest. It's which one we were least willing to forgive, and whether that says more about them or about us. That gap between the decision and the sympathy. That's where the show was always most alive. Come back for a moment to that field. The night. The kneeling. Daryl's fist clenched at his side in the seconds before he moves. We started here, and I've been thinking about it this whole time. About how that one image holds everything the show ever wanted to say about the cost of being human. Daryl isn't the dumbest character in The Walking Dead. But that moment might be the dumbest moment in the franchise, in the strictest technical sense. The one with the highest, most measurable, most far-reaching cost. Glenn dies. Maggie raises her child alone and becomes something harder and fiercer and more alone than she was before. A war gets fought in the shadow of a grief that Daryl will carry for the rest of his story. Across the main show, across the Dixon spin-off, somewhere in the French countryside, still quiet about it, still carrying it the way he always carries things. In the body, without resolution, without letting anyone see it do its work. The stone hit the water. The ripple reached everywhere. And I keep thinking about the whole pattern we've traced together tonight. All these moments, all these people. Sam's whisper in the dark. Laurie's car on a road she had no business being on alone. Nicholas saying thank you to the wrong person at the wrong time. Spencer pouring whiskey for someone who would gut him for it. Eugene saying 8 names on a highway. Finally, after all that distance. Andrea in a dental chair with pliers and not enough time. Beth, scissors in hand, free and choosing not to be. None of these are stories about stupid people. They're stories about people with specific fractures, in specific moments, when the pressure found the exact weak place and didn't stop. The show keeps returning to that story, because it might be the only honest story it knows how to tell. We like to believe that in an impossible situation, we would make the right call. We would stay quiet in the herd, not drive while pregnant and terrified, not punch the man holding the bat. We would pick up the pliers and not talk. But sitting here late, thinking about it honestly, I'm not sure that's actually true. I think most of us faced with enough grief and enough fear and enough love for the people around us would make at least one of these calls, would have at least one moment that looked from the outside like the dumbest thing anyone had ever done. The franchise's consistent answer to who was the dumbest is not a character. It's a condition. It's what happens when human psychology, with all its attachments and terrors and impulsive, uncontrollable love, encounters a world that has no patience for any of it. The apocalypse doesn't create stupidity. It creates exposure. It finds the crack and puts everything it has into that crack until something opens. Daryl Dixon is still alive. At the end of The Walking Dead's main story, he's in France. He's found something like forward motion, something that might become peace, eventually if he's patient enough. He doesn't talk about Glenn much, as far as we can tell. He doesn't talk about most things that cost him. But he carries the weight of that punch the way he carries everything. Quietly, in the body, without resolution. The cost of being the kind of person who would have thrown that punch, the cost of loving people enough to act before thinking, is that you carry the math of it forever. Glenn died, and Daryl knows exactly why. There is no absolution for it. Just the carrying. Just the going forward. If the dumbest moment in The Walking Dead created the most grief the franchise ever produced, if it's the decision that reshaped the most stories and cost the most lives and still hasn't finished landing, does that make it the most human moment too? I think it does. I think that's exactly the point the show was always making. It never wanted you to look at Daryl Dixon in that field and see a stupid man. It wanted you to see the version of yourself that would have thrown the punch. That still might. Drop a stone into still water and watch what happens. The ripple doesn't ask your permission. It doesn't ask if you meant it. It just moves. And somewhere quiet, in a field in France, in a room without enough light, Daryl is still sitting with what it cost. Not saying anything. Just there, still human, still carrying it. That's probably the only answer worth finding.